Hi, and so welcome back to the podcast. And today I have Edy Nathan with me. She's my guest, and she's a trusted voice in the fields of grief, trauma, and sexuality. She has over 20 years of experience as a psychotherapist, a speaker, and she's the author of It's Grief, The Dance of Self Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And her compassionate and insightful approach has made her a sought after expert featured in major media outlets like NBC, Psychology Today, and Thrive Global. And whether you're addressing the complexities of loss, the intersection of trauma and sexuality, or the long term effects of grief, Edy offers insights that are both relatable and deeply transformative. So, welcome to the podcast, Edy. I'm thrilled to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so grateful that you're here. We had a great conversation before we ended up recording this podcast,
We
and
did.
we went through some amazing things. So I'm really hoping all of that's going to shine through today because you really opened my eyes to grief and seeing it in different ways, especially as a woman in midlife. So, can you just like define grief? What is it when you talk about grief? What do you mean by that?
Mm. We don't really tend to think of grief as an overarching theme in our lives because the way that we've been trained is that grief only happens when we lose someone in our lives who we've loved and lost. And my lens expands beyond that for a multitude of reasons, but partially because what we I think don't take into consideration is the minute that the umbilical cord is cut, there's a grief. And that we are, in a way, as we move through all the different phases of our developmental lives, we're cutting the metaphorical cord. And that metaphorical cord can mean growth. It can also mean loss. It can also mean expansion. It can mean excitement. And it can mean tangling with the parts of ourselves that we just don't want to tangle with. And there can be a sense of loss for not only who we've lost and the loved ones we've lost and the depth of those losses, and those are intense and incredible. And when that kind of pain hits, it's uninvited. That kind of grief is never invited. Frankly, no grief is ever really invited. It's not like, there's going to be a knock on the door at the door and it's like it's grief, and it's like, no, you can't come in, and it's like, sorry, you don't have a choice. you know
Yeah.
and in our lives, we also often don't have that choice because certainly for the people we love and lose, we don't have a choice. But also for certain decisions that are made or things that are going on around us in the world that we may or may not agree with, that creates a sense of loss or internal chaos. And so I think of grief as a chaotic time, but I also think of it, when I define it, when people come in to see me, I don't use the word grief because immediately it's like, well, I didn't lose anybody and that's not why I'm here. So the reframe for me, and it's always expanding, and that's what I love to help people see and understand, and probably maybe even gravitate towards, is this idea that you're yearning for something that you've lost, and that it feels like you can't get it back. And truly in life, we keep saying, you'll hear people say, Debbie, oh, I just want to go back to that time, because there's not only a hunger to go back there, there's a yearning. And we really can't go back. I mean, we can be informed of what was, but in terms of going back, we can move forward with the understanding of what was behind us.
Wow. That's powerful because there's so many instances in life then that grief is an emotion for everything that we have to let go of, everything that changes, going from one phase of life to another.
Yes.
we're always letting go of something that maybe we were attached to, maybe was an important part of who we are, who we were, and we have to say goodbye to it. So grief sounds like a very natural part of our lives, and it's going to happen no matter if we want it or not. As you said, coming it comes to the door, and we kind of have to let it in. We don't have a choice. But
Yeah.
and yet we're so resistant to it, of course, because we don't want to feel it, right?
Right. That's right.
So there.
And you just said something that I think is so important. So thank you for bringing this up. We don't want to feel it. We don't want to be with it. We don't want to partner with it. We want to just ignore it. And the thing is, I don't know if you've ever experienced anxiety, but I certainly have. And uh, and part of grief is anxiety. So, you know, and the last thing that we want to feel is that anxiety, because when it comes on, just like grief, it can create dry mouth. It can cause, you to get cold, even though it might be steaming hot outside. It can cause sweat rolling down your back. It can cause projective ideas of what the outcome is going to be. And even if there's nothing in truth around what you're projecting, it feels real. And the more you deny that anxiety, just like the more you deny grief, the bigger it gets. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But what's interesting is that when you meet it where it's at, and instead of saying, no, I'm not going to look at you, I'm not going to deal with you, I'm going to avoid you at all costs, it just keeps hounding you, and it shows up in your gut, or it shows up in your teeth, or it shows up in hunger, or in starvation, or in lack of sleep, and also in sometimes in guilt, or in shame, or in self-loathing. And because it's like, "Ugh, I don't want anybody to know, I don't want to know."
Mm,
And you know when we honor it, when we say, listen, I want you to know I have an anxiety issue here, and it came around when I lost my job, and I feel ashamed around it, and I feel ashamed for having lost my job. It just levels it out. It quiets
mm,
the internal voice. It says, you're not going to take me down because I'm going to name you. And
mm,
somehow it's empowering.
mm. Yeah, when you can speak, when you can let it out in that way. Like you said, I like what you were talking about, because if we don't deal with it, if we don't, I don't like to use the word manage or deal with, but if we don't, um, I think you used a term last time, get in sync with
Yeah,
with the grief in
that's
your
right.
life, right? If you don't get in sync with it, it will start showing up in your body. There
That's
will
right.
be things that start happening to you, and not only your body, but your mind. But in particular, I think our body is a really good barometer for what we're not taking care of in our lives, and what we're not, wanting to look at, like you said.
That's right. That's right.
So paying attention to those things and noticing where we might not be looking at it, I think that's so important. And I think as a woman in midlife, as a woman who's going through menopause, I think it would just amplify symptoms of menopause. So all the things that we're going through, if we're not in sync with the grief, the letting go of whatever it is we need to let go of, if we don't get to that place of even speaking it, like you said, then we're just going to make things worse, I think, as we go through this transition.
Yeah, and I think that it increases some of the symptoms, and of if one is going through menopause, you know, and it can feel like a very lonely journey. And what we've also learned in this in really the work of psychology and trauma and grief is, y- community is essential. We need community for mental health. We need a sense of being able to have a conversation with even just one person. Okay. And because, the introverts out there might say, well, I don't do groups, and that's
Mm.
fine. But maybe there's one person. And if it's not a person, then maybe it's a journal. But taking what's inside and moving it out and even creating some kind of a conversation, even if it's just an internal one, can really help. That expression helps mediate the hmm, the not knowing what's going to come next.
Mm.
Because when there's grief in menopause, or there's grief because of the loss of a loved one, or there's grief because of a sexually traumatic event that has occurred, we don't exactly know how to navigate what comes next because we don't know what comes next. When we're young and we're in school, we have a sense, for most of us, not all, that we're going to go to kindergarten and then first grade and second grade and third grade, and it's very much a linear journey. But grief is as nonlinear as it comes, and we don't know what's going to come next. And we're talking, about the feminine here and the feminine energy, but the masculine has the same stuff, because if we even think about the ever-changing body, during adolescence, and what is going on during that prepubescent those stages, for anyone who is, born in a girl's body or a boy's body, that they are dealing with that forever changing body, and they don't know what's going to come next, and how it is handled within the family system, how it's handled among your friends. And sadly, in some ways, social media does not help, and it can be a shame machine, and it can be a self-loathing
Mhm.
machine. But on the positive side, it's also a way to realize that, oh, well, maybe what's happening in my body is normal, because I see everybody else talking about it. And so you've got this huge spread of kind of the positive information that's coming out on social media, and the negative, which teases or annihilates one's personal or social or sexual identities. And for some cultures, the moving into the aging process, it is held within community. And in other cultures, there's a shunning, or there's a, you're not viable anymore. So
Mm.
as you can see, we're not talking about necessarily the loss of a loved one, but the loss of a role, or the loss of roles that we might have played once in our lives, even in terms of desire for women or desire for men, and the loss upon aging because of medication, because of menopause, because of prostate issues, just because of feeling alone, that one's desire is is shunted, shut down, and you were a person whose identity was closely related to um, having that desire and being desired or looked at in a way that was healthy. I mean,
Mhm.
there's certainly unhealthy, admiration, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about even going to a store and going shopping, and that there are studies, people who are good looking will be attended to. People who sadly are dealing with weight issues won't be, or are aging won't be attended to.
Mm.
And there's
Mm.
grief.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really everywhere. And I like how you mentioned the importance of community, and that we can find community online. There is, social media is a double-edged sword. We talk about the negativity of it because there's comparison. When we start comparing ourselves, then it can be not a great thing. But if we use it as a source of, oh, I'm not alone, that
Yeah,
is such an interesting perspective too, because that is there as well.
that's right.
And that we need to find others who are, yeah, going through similar things, getting or on the other side, or and again, I don't want to say that either because like you said, it's a dance, right?
It's a
It's
dance,
you
it's
come
and
in
it's
and out of grief,
nonlinear,
right?
right. I have clients who said, "I went through menopause and it was, like, really easy, and it's been 10 years, and all of a sudden I'm getting hot flashes." And, of course, the first thing I wanna know is, is there anything going on with your thyroid? Let's get some blood work done. Let's see if there's anything going on before we then look at the psychological, or we look at how are you going to deal with all of a sudden there's something in your body that's causing you to feel things that you had not felt. So it's
Hmm.
and we must, as certainly clinicians, rule out anything that's that may really physically be going on. And certainly menopause is something that manifests physically, but it also manifests in the brain. And and just like women who are pregnant and have rushes of hormones and full heads of hair, and then all of a sudden the hormone levels begin to adjust and readjust, and their hair starts to thin, or they're feeling maybe a little bit of postpartum depression, and they're just not feeling themselves, and it is that loss of who am I was excited about being a mother, and now the last thing I want to be is that mother. And so to understand first, okay, so the hormones are playing a big deal, a big piece in this, and to talk about it, and talk about it with humor, or with seriousness, or with gravitas, and sometimes the throwaway comment can be a really curious one, I because sometimes what we experience can actually cause some of the memories that maybe were put away and put aside to begin to be summoned, and the things that you might not have dealt with, and it might have been an abusive past in some way, that the hormonal, like, charge that's going on in the body starts to bring in the memories of something you might have witnessed. Because when I talk about events that occurred without one's permission, it doesn't necessarily mean that without permission means that it happened to you physically, but even viewing something in the room is something that affects one. Having gotten away untouched, but having viewed it is still a thing that affected you, and affected perhaps how you live in the world. And that's
Mm.
grief.
Okay. And that's all grief. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
And
Yeah.
I'm actually labeling that. I've got a new term that's new kind of to the world, except as it's been used in the loss of a loved one, and the loss of that sexual intimate relationship between a partnership, and that sexual grief. And how I use sexual grief, I call it the sexual grief effect. And the sexual grief effect is when it's a natural response to a sexually traumatic predatory event or developmental hit. And the developmental hits are what happened to us as we're talking about, the first sexual experience, or aging, or disabilities, and how we get how the losses that occur as a result of those developmental pieces that affect all of us, not disabilities, but certainly when one takes certain medications, there are certain things that occur that make one feel disabled, make one feel
Mhm.
that they're not working on all of their cylinders, perhaps sexually, or maybe they feel like they're foggy. And then we've got the hormonal fog, or we've got the fog that actually does happen after cancer treatment, or during cancer treatment. So
Yes.
I'm using this sexual grief effect to cover kind of the impact on one's personal, social, and sexual identities, and affects one's ability to thrive and learn and be in the world fully, and also how it might affect one's intimate relationships. And it's grief.
It's all grief.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and there's so many places then where this and do you consider grief an emotion? I'm gonna call it an emotion. Is it an emotion, I
Sure it is.
guess?
It's an emotion.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's an emotion that covers many emotions. So when I look at
Mhm.
grief, in my book, it's grief. I don't talk about sexual grief. That's a new book that I'm actually working on. Uh, and whose working title is Dare to Live. But I would say that when I think about the 11 phases, it covers an array of emotions because there are so many emotions from the emotional armor phase, which includes numbness and kind of a dissociative experience and denial and just really overwhelm, and that those are all emotions just as a initial go-to. And I think that people go to that first phase time and time again. Every time there's a growth spurt, it's like, okay, so now let me go inside myself, and going inside the self can look like lot of different things depending on the person, right? But that emotional armor phase kind of covers that. But then there's anger and there's rage and there's anxiety, and I see that the anger and the anxiety within grief, though I see them as different phases, they commingle. Like anxiety, I think, is often occurs when anger doesn't get expressed, and we need
Mm.
our anger. It helps us to move and to maybe grow, and yet when it's not expressed, it goes into anxiety. And that
Mm.
was something that I actually learned when I was terribly phobic, and I was finally breaking out of my phobias. And phobias were it was definitely grief around how limited my life was. And what I realized was I was on this New York City subway, and it was at a time when, chains were being stolen off of people's necks, and it was just a crazy time. And it was like, oh, I'm doing this. I'm on the subway, and I'm really gonna I'm breaking through this anxiety, and it's gonna be fine. But I could feel like my anxiety was growing, and it was like I only had two more stops. And then this guy like reached for my chain, and I grabbed his wrist. We were at like the second stop before I was to get off, and I said, "Don't you expletive dare."
Mhm.
And he stopped, and I said it loudly. The train stopped. I got off the train, and I had no anxiety. And
Wow.
it was in that moment, Debbie, that I was like, "Oh, this is amazing. All I had to do was get angry. Bring it on." And the anxiety was gone. And I walked the 8 blocks or 10 blocks, and it was my first real experience of freedom from the anxiety.
Oh,
And
wow.
that was a light bulb moment.
Oh, wow. That was yeah, it was just in the moment that you
Yeah,
it was a
yeah,
very split decision to do
yeah.
that,
That's
but
right.
it changed the trajectory,
It
right?
totally
The
did. And so,
yeah,
though I would never wish for anybody to have to, for anyone to have to um, go through that or have a
yeah,
chain ripped off of their neck. Um, I think that incident may have saved my life. And so
yeah,
I'm thrilled, actually. And that's when I say, grief can be our greatest teacher. And
mhm,
there was grief in that anxiety, and it wasn't something that I chose, that knock on the door. But because of that, something opened up, and it was amazing.
and do you find that it that is what we're trying to do as we go through grief, and that is the gift of grief, like, if we're willing to walk with it and go, be with it,
Partner with
that
it. Say, it's here, And instead of trying to push you away, this is what
Mhm.
I'm going to do is I'm going to say, come on, walk with me. You know,
Yeah.
when I was 27, I lost my partner, and he wore a Timex watch, and I didn't keep a whole lot of things of his. I have a shirt, and I have this watch, and when I am remembering him, I'll wind the watch, and I'll hear it tick, and I'll remember it on his wrist, and he really taught me what love was. And it's not that, I walk around thinking about him 24/7. I don't. I do this work because of him, because I was so lost after he died, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was going into the corporate world, and I was going to do training, and I was acting on the side, and because we were actors together. And it his loss again changed the trajectory of my life, because the way that people were responding to my loss was, you'll don't worry, you'll find somebody else, don't worry, you're young. And it was like, those were not the messages I needed to understand or hear, and it certainly wasn't helping me, and it wasn't meeting me where I was at. But people feel helpless, and they want I wrote, actually, I write for Psychology Today, and if anybody's interested, there's an article that I wrote called "What Not to Say." What not to
Yes.
say to people who are grieving. And I've got a lot of articles, on there about sexuality, and it's free. Anyone can go there. And when people feel helpless, they just want to say something. And sometimes just waiting and calling 3 months after the loss can be incredibly helpful, because about the 3-month mark is where people start to disappear, and the holding begins to kind of cease. Not necessarily the close people, but it does shift. There's a shifting, because people go on with their lives. And what I learned in this passing of my partner was, wow, like, it's 3 months in, it's 6 months in, and it's quiet now. And more is needed. And it began my whole exploration in, first Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's really, her 5 stages were for people who were dying, and she did incredible research on people who were dying, and that the work has been expanded through the wonderful work of David Kessler and his 6 stages and grief. And so I expand to 11 phases, because I see them as so linear, and they are really a suggestion, because there's so much more that, you
Mhm.
could probably, it's a recipe, but there's no right way to follow it.
Yeah. Okay. So you have this is in your book, the
And
11
yes, the
stages
11
or
phases,
phases,
the
11
11
phases
phases
of
of
grief.
grief. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And you said and they're not necessarily linear. I mean, you're not
No,
going to do
I
one,
mean,
go
how
through
do
one
you
after the,
present ideas?
yeah.
Um, so they're presented, and what I say to the reader in the book is very simply, I see the first phase, the emotional armor phase, as the go-to phase, and I see that we continue to loop back to it. I also think it's where we start. I think there's numbness, and there is this, denial, and there is this sense of being stuck or resistant. We've used denial, and denial was used consistently, but I've reframed it a little bit. And if I rewrite that section, I would probably now call it resistance rather than denial. It's a
Mm.
resistance to what's in front of you. It's a resistance to grief saying, oh, I'm going to knock, but whether you let me in or not, I'm coming in. And
Yeah.
so I also used, hysteria, and instead of hysteria, I'm really using like like it's just a, it's a it's a dislocation of the self. It's like you just feel like you don't know where you belong.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that. Yeah, I feel that for sure. I'm just thinking back to moments of my own grief and loss and thinking about what that means, but also then thinking about it in terms of women who are going through this phase where things are changing, their bodies are changing, our bodies are changing, our maybe mindset is changing because I just think the physical or hormonal change just sets off all kinds of change that's happening in our lives. It can affect our relationships, it can affect our work, it can affect everything that we own,
That's
we
right.
identify with,
Completely,
right?
which is the really like the sexual grief and the idea of sexual grief is that you feel imprisoned by what happens to you. And
Mhm.
so you can't turn back the clock. Menopause is happening, about to happen, or you've you've danced with it and you've gone through it, you believe. But for many women, um, not without the voice of change, like affecting so much of who you thought you were. And
Yeah.
this sense of imprisonment is as if it's almost like holding you hostage in a way, and it's holding, it's taken your desire and it's thrown it away, and it's like it's taken your natural lubrication, and it's like I don't even know like what to do, and I don't know who to talk to, and I don't necessarily want to be sitting around and talking with my friends about something that feels so intimate and sacred, and it's scary, and yet sometimes it's the very thing that's needed, is to say, listen, girlfriends, I am
Mhm.
not like I don't even know what's going on down there, but I can tell you it's not the same, and I don't feel the same, and I don't feel like I can even like imagine having sex anymore, or sex that's comfortable anymore, or because it's getting painful and I don't understand. And nobody is talking about the fact that in many ways, and I have a term for this, that the vagina is grieving, and it's
Mhm.
grieving, and the loss of how it used to be. And there's
Mhm.
so much that we can do, and there's so much conversation that we can be having about this. And it starts with what I'm calling the liberation protocol. And this liberation protocol is, let's start with embodied curiosity. So, a lot of women don't even want to talk about their vaginas. They don't even want to name it. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to say down there, and if that's what you need to do, okay. Or maybe they want to give it a name, or however the framework is, but let's take maybe a little bit of the shame, or maybe a little bit of the self-loathing, or the disgust that you might have with having a relationship with something that's been part of you your entire life. And
Mhm.
let's normalize it. And let's say it's
Yeah.
okay. And to say, hey, you know what? I just heard this woman talk on a podcast, and her name's Edie, and she was talking about lubrication. Lubrication, really? Yeah. And she was saying, you know what, you can try a whole bunch of different lubrications. You can actually try mixing some CBD oil in with your lubrications, and it might actually help you relax, and it might help you open up a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with getting a dilator and having a relationship with a part of you that maybe the only time you had a relationship with it was when you were in partnership with your partner. And
Mhm.
maybe you've never had a relationship with it. And maybe, like some women who I work with, they say, you know what? I am so glad to not have any desire anymore. Now I can actually get things done. And you know what? If that's the case, cool. You got you,
Yes.
I don't want to change that. If you're fine with it, I'm fine with it. The only time
Yeah.
I want to have a conversation about doing something different or going through the liberation protocol is when it's an obstacle because we can
Hmm.
normalize all of it.
Yes. Yeah. And when you were talking, the grief I was thinking about too, which relates to that, is just the grief of being desired and feeling like you've lost that, like feeling that you've lost the because you seem a bit invisible, like people aren't looking at you. I think you mentioned that
Yes, we
earlier
talked
too.
about that. We talked about that in our call.
That's it. So just not being seen maybe by others, but feeling also unattractive, feeling like you don't even recognize your body, you don't feel desirable. So I think there's that, and a lot of the women I talk to have put on some weight. So they're going through this like grieving their old body, wanting to get back to the old body, and maybe going through that resistance you talked about.
Uh-huh. Yes, that's
Stuck in
right.
resistance.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And so
Yeah.
they can begin to have an embodied curiosity like, are there parts of my body that do feel good to me? And okay, so I've put on some weight, probably around the middle, maybe a little bit in the back area. And okay. So this is my changing body, and maybe there are some things that I can do. One of the things we know for sure is exercise. And I'm not talking about going out and running a marathon, but we do know walking and even if it's 15 or 20 minutes a day, can really help and help our mindset. Doing
Mhm.
some, weight bearing exercises, not only because of what's going on within our bodies, but the other side of what's going on with our bodies has to do with bone and bone density and weight bearing exercises a couple times a week. And again, you don't have to spend the money to go to a gym. You free weights, I think you can get some free weights, 2-pound weights for $10. So because I want to appeal to all people, and not everybody can afford this. And frankly, if you can't afford weights, go buy 2 pounds of sugar. Okay. And because I'm really serious, like it doesn't have to be weights. It can be sugar, and you can just use the sugar or use flour, like things that are easy to buy. Put them in baggies and use those as weights. So because sometimes people don't even live near a place where they can get the weights. So this is
Yeah.
for all people, all women, no matter where you are financially, no matter where you live, if you live out in the boondocks, you may not be able to go get weights, but my guess is you can get flour. My guess is
Yeah.
you have access to flour. So, um, using weight bearing exercises really helps the bone. Using Kugel exercises and these exercises can actually help with your vaginal strength and can help actually if you are interested in having a sexual life in with your partner, then there are so many things that you can do. And that's truly embodied curiosity. And then having some empathy for yourself, which means kick the judge out the door. Okay, so maybe those size X pants aren't fitting you and you need to go to the next size. So you go to the next size and you do so without the judge, understanding that yes, your body is changing, but you've gained wisdom or you've gained insight or you've gained a certain patience that you didn't have. And there's grief over that changing body. Now, does it mean that you can't change that body? Maybe you can. And maybe it's about realizing that the way that you've been eating worked for you and now you need to be in discovery, and that's also part of your empathy. And that
Mm,
empathy takes energy. And maybe you don't feel like you have the energy, but do you have the energy for the judge and the critic? Because if you've got energy for them,
mhm,
then let's give equal energy and empathy to exploration. And the exploration of maybe the Mediterranean way of eating. Maybe I need to cut down sugar. Maybe I need to eat at a different time. And so there are so many different ways to counter the grief by saying, I want to get to my heart and I want to get to liberation. And so I'm going to go in with embodied curiosity. I'm going to have some empathy, taking the judge and moving the judge and the critic away. And then I'm going to get into radical rapport, which means becoming friends with the person you are right now.
mm,
And those
mm.
are just the first three protocols.
I love that. I love everything you said, and I just love the first one, which is just curiosity. I think perhaps we've lived until this point just going through the motions, not having to really explore it because the things we were doing worked and it wasn't an exploration, like you said. And now, because things have changed significantly and probably haven't since we entered puberty, not as much. So it's just like now we have to go into exploring and knowing that the things we were doing maybe aren't working, but there's so many other options and
That's
there's
right.
so many other things to explore. And
Oh,
maybe this is the time of opening up. Maybe this grief is telling us we need to open ourselves up to
that's
new
right.
ideas.
That's
Yeah,
that's right.
I
That's
love that.
right. And
So
if you
good.
are in partnership, I'm a big believer in, shared breathing and looking into Tantra and looking into what other pleasure points do you have in your body? And it may be that you and your partner have distanced and don't have that conversation going anymore. And maybe you want to have that conversation. And it's not like, let's sit down and talk, versus, I heard something, blame it on something else other than just, I want to have this conversation because usually partners don't, I don't want to sit down and talk about this, but
No.
I heard this, or someone was talking about this, or I heard about a book and I've been reading it and I wanted to share this passage with you. That makes them feel invited into your world rather than feeling as if there's a recrimination in their world.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, not just saying, "We need to talk," because
Yeah,
that's always a scary phrase,
yeah,
but
that's right.
actually
Never
inviting
works
them
out
in.
well, rarely,
No, it
you
doesn't.
know,
But
right?
any topic, yeah, especially as we are going through menopause and it can be a difficult subject to broach. Like you said,
Right.
even to our girlfriends, we have a
That's
hard time saying the word vagina for a lot of
that's
us, right? So
right. That's right. So I just heard somebody talk about vagina grieving. Can you believe that? Well, and you know what? It made sense because it's like she's not working the way she used to work.
Yeah.
And I'm sad because there's a
Mhm.
loss. And I don't know what I'm up against.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's a lot there to grieve, and I really loved talking about this because I think it's not something we give a voice to very often.
No,
Especially in this way of grieving, of like, yes, it's a transition we're going through. We're letting go of something we were that we can't get back to embrace something new. And maybe we can get to something even better, but we don't know. It's that uncertainty, like you said, we
that's
don't
right.
know what's
That's
coming.
right. That's
So
right.
that's the other piece of
So
it.
that
But this is
embodied
so good.
curiosity of, well,
Yes.
okay, well, what other ways are there to bring pleasure into our lives, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's a
just
time of
and
exploration.
that's right, the time of exploration, deep, deep curiosity. That's why I call it embodied curiosity. It's
Embodied.
completely embodied. And
Mm,
it's like, let's just explore. Let's explore. Let me explore. Yeah. Let me open up.
okay.
Yeah.
I love it. I think it's so needed. So I'm going to wrap up this conversation. There's so many other things we could talk about, but that's it for today. But I want to know, and it's a question I ask all my guests, what's been the best part of getting older so far for you, Edie?
Mm. Being inquisitive, continuing to like, oh, wow. Like now I want to explore this and this and this. And it's that my own curiosity has just been on fire. And 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 to be able to honor it in such a way that I'm not afraid of being judged. I don't know that 20 years ago I could have as freely and openly spoken about what I spoke about today. And or even had the foresight to think, well, what is this? What is this experience? And um to realize that the journey is big and broad and exciting, and um we can still be unstoppable.
Yes. Yes. That is so good. Inquisitive. I love that word. And I think that this is the time for it. This is where
Yeah.
we get to be inquisitive. This is where maybe that whole, like, as you were mentioning earlier, was like we had this prescribed life, maybe like kindergarten and grade one, and then maybe we got married and had kids, and maybe we've lived a very prescriptive life up until now. And now where we find ourselves at this point where nobody's ever really told us
Yeah.
and that this was coming, and we might feel lost in many ways and grieving many ways, like this prescriptive life that we thought we were leading. And
Mhm.
now this is the phase of embodied curiosity and getting
Yes.
inquisitive. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think that this is a beautiful time when we think about it that way. So I appreciate that view.
Oh, I'm so happy. I'm so happy.
So, I mean, I'm sure there's women who are going to listen to this and who would like to connect with you. So where can they find you? And I know you do have your book as well, so where can they find the book too?
Absolutely. So you can find the book on Amazon. And I just want to say that if you have a little bookstore in your neighborhood, go to that bookstore and say, I'd like to order Edy Nathan's book, It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And I'm also interested in her journal called It's Grief, Notes to Self, which is a 3-month journal, because it is those little small indie bookstores that we need to support. And every time you go in and you order something, you keep them alive. So I just want to say that I think it's just so 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 very important. The other way that you can certainly get to me is through my website, which is my name, edynathan.com. And that's really, really pretty easy, straightforward. And
Mhm.
I would also say that on November 10th, I have a free webinar that's going on between 6 and 7 o'clock through an organization called End Science. And it's I have actually a 6 hour seminar that is the prequel to, and this is called Sexual Trauma and the Grief That Follows: An Introduction to the Sexual Grief Effect. And I'm just going to be talking a lot about this, and you can find the information about this on my website. So if you want to do just a free deep dive, you can do that, and you can see what else I'm working on.
Okay, we'll definitely do that, and I'm going to include the links for all those things. on my in my show notes, sorry.
Great.
And so that anybody who wants to attend the webinar, because this episode will air before that webinar, so they'll have a chance to sign up. So that's great. And yeah, go to your local bookstore. What a great idea. Beautiful. I really appreciate that. And I think all the bookstore owners will really appreciate that too. So thank you so much. Thank you, Edie, for being such a wonderful guest. This has been really eye opening and needed to start these kinds of conversations, even if they're just with ourselves.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to share these progressive ideas that we don't want to talk about. So
Mhm.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.